Hey, good evening, everybody. This is Patrick Milliken from the Poison Pen Bookstore, and I'm really excited to have two good friends, well, three, including Barbara, but Megan Abbott, to discuss her really wonderful new book, The Turnout. I can't get this quite right. And Tasha Alexander, our good friend, is kindly agreed to come in and talk to Megan. And here is, we still have some signed copies of her latest book, The Dark Heart of Florence. For those of you watching on Facebook, I'll go ahead and put in the comments field links. We are going to be getting some signed copies of the Turnout very shortly, and I'll put a link in the comments field if you'd like to order one. And I will be kind of lurking in the background for a while, but I have some questions too for Megan, so I'll come back up from the darkness when I'm summoned. But Barbara, I'm going to turn it over to you for now.
Thank you, Patrick. I hate the way he just, well, I don't hate it. It's interesting the way he disappears in the dark. You know, you're welcome to hang around if you just want to hear the whole discussion. We don't have to exile you. This is a special treat because I can remember all the way back to what I believe is Megan's first novel. Although, Megan, I noticed when I was looking in this publication list here that there was a book listed before Die a Little called The Street Was Mine. What was that?
That was my dissertation. It's a study of crime fiction and film noir. So it is my first book technically, but it's very dense reading.
Okay. Well, in any case, I love Die a Little, which was a wonderful Hollywood noir. And Megan and I met over that because I'm trying to remember whether we just sent her a ton of copies to sign or whether she came see us. Do you remember?
I think I came on the second book. Maybe the first. It was very early. I remember it was sort of super exciting because I had always heard about the Poison Pen. So it was a big early thrill for me in my first few years on the circuit.
This wonderful.
What's that, Patrick?
DVD, yes, the one with the Arizona connection, Bury Me Deep.
Yeah.
Right. Well, it's always wonderful to find an author at their first book and then follow them on. And we've had the same glorious experience with Tasha, who has written, is it 15 now, Lady Emily Mysteries, Tasha?
That's right.
Yep. 15. And we've been together for all of those too. It's one of my very favorite series, set originally towards the end of the 19th century, but now we've vaulted into the early 20th century. And I think it's just a wonderful book, and series. Megan may talk to Tasha a little bit about it as we move along. So Megan, this book has attracted an extraordinary amount of coverage. Review in the New York Times, I just saw yesterday, maybe it's not in print yet, and so forth. And you had an exciting announcement that you might want to make before Tasha kicks off this.
Oh yeah, it was exciting. It's the Today Show Read with Jenna book pick of the month for August. So they announced it yesterday on the Today Show, which my grandmother, were she still with us, would have been her proudest moment. She religiously watched that show every morning since it began. So it was a special treat to get to see it there.
Well, that is really exciting. And the only other thing I would like to say is that I think that you have a quote from Catherine Ann Porter at the very front of the book, which I think says a lot about what the story is about. Childhood is the fiery furnace in which we are melted down to essentials, and that essential shaped for good, or possibly, I'm going to add, shaped for bad. So on that note, Tasha, I'm going to turn this over to you, and I will interrupt as I often do if I feel like it.
Please do. Please do. Well, Megan, I loved reading this book because it's beautifully written, first of all, as your books always are. And the voice is so engaging, which is a real skill to be able to pull off in a book that has this much darkness in it.
It is.
But that's.
Yeah, it was just. No, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say that was the trickiest part for me at the beginning is nailing the voice. So yeah, that always is how I start. I don't know if I have a book till then.
Well, I think voice is always the thing that, like, you can't fix voice. You can fix the plot, you can tweak a character, but if the voice isn't right, I don't know how you fix that. So you nailed it. And the thing is that I think with this story, it's so perfect because you have this really engaging voice with this element of darkness to it. And that's kind of the whole thing with ballet. You have this art that is just ethereally beautiful. And it's, it's a very athletic thing to do, but you never make it look that way. When you're dancing, you're supposed to be making it look like, oh, no, I'm just doing these pirouettes. Oh, is that hard? Oh, no, it's not. A good dancer doesn't show us that she's working. And of course, under the surface, you're in all this pain, your feet especially. And I think any of us who have even flirted with ballet for even a few years, especially if you were on point, obviously, there's a lot of pain, physical pain in ballet, but there's also a lot of emotional pain. And I think especially for young women, for girls, it taps into so much in terms of body image and weight. And there's also, I think with ballet, something, it's beautiful, it's pretty. And there's kind of a lot of a backlash against the pink, right? You're supposed to be doing something edgy and cool. And why are you dancing Swan Lake? But so you've got this really brutal underlayer, both physically and emotionally. And so I just think just the way you wrote this book really captures that in terms of the voice and the story and getting all of the beauty and all of the bitter pain underneath that. So how did you put yourself into that world?
It was a thank you so much for saying all that, by the way. Those were all really the tensions that I wanted to explore, even though I wouldn't have been able to say it. You know how at the beginning you don't really know what you're doing. You're just kind of, I like ballet, and ballet schools are interesting. But the more I wrote, it was just that tension between this sort of pearly facade of immaculate perfection and everything that goes into that, including sort of the wear and tear on the body, the sort of stress, the discipline, that feels very much in some ways about what being a woman is like. The face you're supposed to put on, that you are unfazed by anything. You're the good girl is going to do the right thing, the people pleaser, all these sort of things that are expected of women. But I didn't know how to, that all came later. Early on, it was really just a sort of, if I wanted to write about, I admit, and I want to hear about your ballet experience, but I did have 2 years of ballet as an 8 and 9-year-old, and I was really awful, and just didn't. Also, when that's the age when you haven't developed anything remotely like what a ballet dancer's body, so we had sort of pigeon-breasted, and it was just. But the school that I went to, the Casale School of Dance, was run by 2 sisters, and they were actually twins. Whereas in the book, they're not twins. That would be, real life is always too good to use in fiction. But they were so glamorous to me, and they were so fascinating, and they were very exotic to all of us in the class, and we really were always imagining what their lives were like, and they never revealed anything. And I really wanted to write about that and I get behind that. And so I just kept writing until I could imagine Dara, who's the sort of older sister, the more authoritative one. I felt like I could really capture the intensity with which she took ballet, how she had grown up with it, how it had been, she inherited it from her mother, and it was really trying to get that. So I was trying to get behind the scrim of those 2 sisters that taught me all those years ago in that strip mall ballet studio. So did you have early dance too?
I did. I mean, I was completely obsessed with ballet. I did 13 years. It's for me, I don't know. I don't even remember how it started. I mean, I was so little when I started taking it. I don't remember it at the first school I was at, but I was kind of good at, I wasn't Gelsey Kirkland or something, but I was good enough that they moved me into another school. And it's so funny because, when you're a kid, you have such a weird view of what's going on around you. So I was absolutely terrified of my teacher, Madame Buchkowski, who she was just frightening. First of all, we did not have recitals. You went on stage when you could audition for a company and make it. You did not trot around in a little tutu in front of your parents taking pictures. That was verboten. I remember that she would make we'd have to lean forward and have our backs perfectly flat. And there was a boy in my class, and as with most ballet classes, there are hardly any boys. So this poor boy, he was always kind of messing up, and she would take an empty coffee can, like a Folgers coffee or something, and she would fill it with water. And if your back wasn't flat, she would put it on your back, sort of so that, it would fall. And then the water would go everywhere and you'd be mortified. And that, I suppose, is supposed to make you, think that do a better job of keeping your back flat. But so I was scared of her, and I never thought she liked me. And I only found out years later that she thought I was talented, but I was just always terrified of her. And that's my main memory of her. But what I didn't realize was, I did all these years of it. So obviously I wasn't not enjoying it, or I would have stopped. But she really, I don't know what it was, how she did it. As an adult watching ballet, after I had stopped dancing, I was always drawn to the Russian dancers. Always, just the way they move their backs, the way they do port de bras. There are no dancers really anywhere else in the world that have the same technique as those Russian dancers, the Mariinsky, the Kirov dancers. And when I wrote my ballet book and I started digging into this research about Russian ballet.
We may have lost her for a minute. They have a wobbly
From
internet.
a White Russian.
Oh, there she comes back.
She may need to, Patrick, yeah, there she goes. I'll fill in and talk about my own ballet. Oh, you're back.
She's back.
Okay.
I'm back. I don't know what happened. I
That's
don't know
okay.
how much you heard.
It was the Russians. You're talking about the Russian dancers who are, they are so different, and they have such a different intensity.
And what I came to find out when I started doing research for my ballet book, when I was digging into sort of the late imperial period in St. Petersburg and the Imperial Ballet, I found out that my teacher was actually from a White Russian family, because she was about 470 years old when she was teaching me. Her parents had fled the revolution, moved to Paris, and she, as a little girl, took ballet from one of the prima ballerinas who fled after the revolution. And so she had instilled in us this love of the Russian technique. And she was essentially teaching what we think of now as Vaganova, the Russian technique. But what really struck me about that was I never knew that's what she was doing. It was never spoken, but somehow she just instilled that in us so much without saying it, that even 30 years later, I was still carrying it in my head. So there's something about ballet. I mean, when you dance, you think about things getting into your muscle memory. You remember a sequence, you remember whatever you're doing, a set of moves, and it's in your muscle memory. But there's something about ballet that like gets into the memory in your soul or something. There's something really that pulls you in about it. And honestly, I think for most people, it starts with those point shoes. They're so beautiful. Everyone, when you're a little girl, all you wanted are the point shoes. And you did such a great job with talking about how the dancers prepare their shoes. So tell us a little bit about that, how you found that, because it's such an individual thing.
Yes, I was fascinated by that, because it is sort of, you can look online and you can see these factories. There's not that many that make point shoes, and there are these beautiful factories in Italy and France, and they make each individual pair of shoes, and it's such care, and they're so these beautiful satin objects. And then the minute the dancers get them there, they sort of tear them apart because it needs to become the second skin. And so this is sort of one of the advantages of being a writer in the age of social media, because there are literally thousands of videos on YouTube of dancers showing what their technique is for getting their point shoes to fit their feet the way they want. And they're all very wedded to their particular approach. And some of them, will in fact, as Marie, the dancer in the book, that takes a hammer to hers, but others would never do that. And some, sort of, you have to bend them in the door, and they, it's like taking razors to the bottom. So it has some, to grab the stage a bit and isn't going to make any noise. And it just, the ritual of it was almost religious. And going back to what you were saying, I do think it goes really deep. It's emotional, and it's sort of, you carry it with you because it's sort of, there's something sort of sacred about that. Oh, did we lose Tasha again?
It's a hazard with living in a ranch in Wyoming. What I think is interesting about the book, Megan, aside from the dancing, is the family. And, you've created this family with a legacy.
I hope.
That the girls apparently can't escape.
Yes. And in some ways, it's sort of ballet is the cover story for really it being about this family, and ballet is the thing that joins them. Dara and Marie, the two dancers that run the school in the book, their mother was a ballet dancer and essentially raised them to live entirely in the world of dance. And so they can't separate it either. They can't separate ballet from the family, and sort of created this super insular dynamic in the household that, even though, and this is no spoiler, you find out very early, their mother is no longer with us, nor is their father, but they carry it with them. They teach at the school she founded. They live in the house that they were raised in, and they can't really escape it. It is their second skin, like the point shoe.
Very much so. Tasha, you're back? No? Yes, she is. Tasha, can you hear us?
Sorry. I sometimes can hear you. What I didn't realize is that tomorrow is the day that our internet switches over for the new month. So we're at the end of our monthly internet allowance. And so evidently it is not happy with us.
Well,
Zoom keeps flashing up saying your connection is unstable. I'm like, thank you. I noticed that. I want to ask you quickly before my internet freezes again. I really loved how you used the Nutcracker, because the Nutcracker is a piece. It is the ballet that we all know collectively. Even if you're not really interested in ballet, you know something about the Nutcracker. And I think it really makes the book more accessible to the non-ballet people, and it pulls them in. So how did you come to that? And talk a little bit, if you would, about Clara Marie, because in the book versus Tchaikovsky's or Petipa's choreography of the ballet.
Yes, I really use the Nutcracker solely because every dance studio talked about how that was their moneymaker, right? That's how they made their money all years. They would all have these productions, and everyone in the community comes, and it makes all the girls in the audience want to join that, take classes at that ballet school. So that is really, and it's sort of the ballet I still go to every year here at the New York City Ballet. So I picked it for that, but then it really had this sort of, I realized once I got into it that it, much as Barbara, you were saying, it's very connected to the notion of family and coming of age and young girls and women. If anyone remembers the basics of the Nutcracker, it's a young girl who's named Clara in most of the versions people will see, but is actually Marie, who's also the name of one of the characters in the book. And the story it's based on is a E.T.A. Hoffman, who writes scary stories. He's sort of known as the writer of scary stories, like Sandman. He's the original writer of Sandman, and it's sort of a very dark fairy tale, and it's sort of in the way that fairy tales are very explicitly about a young girl entering womanhood, and her her godfather, who wears an eye patch, as we all know from the Nutcracker. There's something a little sinister pretty sinister in the original version about how he gives her this little man. She takes the little man to bed with her, and it's a very dark and strange and kind of wonderful story. But in its variations of the ballet and through the Balanchine one, which is really designed as like a holiday spectacle, that part has sort of been like papered over, but it's still in there. And I think still when little girls watch it, they are thinking of it as, I will be Clara. I will enter the adulthood, and it will be this sort of candied wonderland and delight. So it was really fun to sort of tease out all of those connections.
Well, it's definitely a ritual that people, families have embraced. But honestly, Megan, when I read it, I thought an awful lot about high school and the prom, the prom queen and the prom king, because basically that's what we're doing here in the ballet school is, which girl gets to be Clara and which gets to be the male lead. And it seemed to me the dynamic is so simple. I mean, so similar to high school and choosing the prom queen and the prom queen. And only today I read something about Disney and the princess culture that it has fostered. And it seems to me that that's part of what's going on here too, is that, ballet appears to be, because of the costumes, because of the roles, because of the music and so forth, very much in that kind of Disney princess tradition, where every little girl gets to not just dress up on Halloween in her pink costume and her crown, but, actually be the princess. Tasha, did you feel the same?
Yeah, I did. And I think because one of the things that Megan, you do so beautifully in the book is getting this darker undercurrent of what's going on, not just beneath the dancer's physical experience, but also emotionally. With most of the really famous ballets, they have really dark elements to them. I mean, Giselle, right? I mean, Giselle, like she's dead. She's with the Willies, Swan Lake. It generally isn't just a happy little story. And so the Nutcracker, you can just sort of ignore those parts with Clara and the man, the little man in her bed, which is a little weird, let's be honest, right? But there's often that undercurrent in ballet, and I actually wrote it down because you're talking. So I have to say though, that it's a little hard to talk about this book because we don't want to ruin it. So there's only so much we can say. So, but you have this wonderful line where you're talking about, well, I think Dara is thinking about Charlie, her husband, and he had been a dancer in the school taught by her mother. And he has been horribly injured. And so he not only can't dance anymore, but he can't even teach. And you say that his body is a living reminder of how beautiful things could all be broken inside. And I think that just really caught me and made me think, because I think there's so much there. I don't know, maybe this is crazy. What do you think? I feel like we almost want there to always be something broken behind beauty. We don't want it to just be beautiful, right? And at the same time, no, go ahead.
I think that's actually the tension even in the Nutcracker, but certainly most ballets, it's sort of, there's a lot of suicide and madness, and they are really full of this, and they're really strong roles for women, which is ballet is one of the places where that happens, and there is a lot of drama and energy. And Clara, in the second act of the Nutcracker, she does just sit on this throne. She is like the prom queen. But in the first act, she goes through this entire experience where she takes on the Rat King and throws her shoe at him, and she sort of goes through this kind of drama. There's this notion that this is what you have to do to get to the other side. You have to enter darkness and enter forbidden places, and in some ways go against your parents errands and all these things that she has to do. So I think that one of the reasons that girls so respond to ballet is it allows for all these contradictions while assuring you that this is still perfectly appropriate, because what girl doesn't want to be a ballerina? But meanwhile, it becomes this way to explore all this messier stuff that's inside. I mean, was that how? Do you remember the first time you saw the Nutcracker?
I was too little to remember the first time, but like you, I mean, we would go every year. And we would always, well, because my parents were very they're like, we need to watch the videotape of the Baryshnikov one because, whatever, which, okay, fair enough. It's Baryshnikov. But I think you're absolutely right about it is one of the few art forms where women are the stars, and not just because they're pretty. I mean, the roles have depth to them. And I mean, if you think about Balanchine, who's arguably certainly the greatest choreography of the 20th century, if not the greatest ballet choreographer ever. I mean, his official view was, look, the men are here to just help her balance or lift her, not even help really, but just they're props really, so that the ballerina can do what the ballerina needs to do. It's really a woman's art more than a man's, and that's really unusual in the creative world.
It is, and it's so interesting too, because Balanchine famously said ballet is woman, and he was really, I mean, there's lots of problematic things with Balanchine. One is that he had a very specific physical body type that he wanted in a ballerina, and that really did become dominant, is only recently starting to change. But he really did foreground these women and these great female dancers. You mentioned Gelsey Kirkland, and her book, it was quite controversial at the time, her memoir, Dancing on My Grave, was a big influence. I couldn't not be in this book because the way she talks about all of it. And in fact, the way she talks about the Turnout, which at that time wasn't even the title of the book, but became so, because she talks so much about the sort of costs and drama, but all behind all that beauty, but how she had to keep going, just like you were saying, it was almost like you're being hypnotized into it in some way. So I think it does exert this hold. And in the case of Dara and Marie, their mother actually embodied it. Not only is it their ballet teacher is their mother. So it's like a double bind.
Right. And that oh, go ahead.
No, you go on while you're still with us.
Oh,
talk.
Well, yeah. Well, having it be their mother who has achieved that, it tells them it's possible for them, not just, oh, well, Gelsey Kirkland can do it, or Maria Tallchief could do it, or Margot Fontaine. No, this is my mother. She could do it. And then that's loads more pressure. You're living in a house with someone who did this. You're having very personal, intimate moments with someone who lived this life. And so it puts more pressure on you. It makes it so that you don't have, it's really hard when you're in that ballet world to have an outside world regardless. But if your mother is in it, it's just all the harder for these girls.
Yeah, so it became this perfect way to talk about the way a family can be too overly enmeshed as this family is. They're so caught up in the family lore, and it's connected to ballet, so there's no escaping it. In the ballet school they run, everyone is invested in the drama and glamour of the Durant family. So it was in some ways a sort of heightening what I think is always already there for all of us who've taken ballet or even sort of dreamed of it, that it does exert this hold because it taps into things about us, particularly as girls and women.
It seems to me that it's really hard to talk about this without thinking about the gymnasts and the whole Simone Biles thing that has gone on. And it's very similar because the gymnasts actually create a family with a coach and, the team and so forth. It really is the same dynamic, don't you think, Tasha and Megan, is that you're seeing in this book? And then there's, the mental health aspect has both been criticized and praised by a lot of people. It's very controversial. As some people think she should just, suck it up and do it. And other people are going, no, it was brave of her, to speak out and talk about the risk of injury. thinking about Charlie and, did he ever get to speak out before he became crippled in the book? See, I think Charlie, in many ways, the most interesting character in the book. I think that Charlie is a real tragedy in this book. And I unfortunately, we're not able to discuss it, but when you read the book, I think if you follow along Charlie's story, it isn't just the women who are damaged in this world by a lot.
Yeah, I'm so glad you both have pointed him out. He was a character that meant a lot to me because when I wrote the book about gymnastics, I had read a lot about this too, this sort of, Simone Biles talked about twisties, and that's a thing that there's a version of that in ballet. There's a version of that in every sport where you lose your center of gravity and your muscle memory fails you. And I was sort of haunted by all these stories that I had read about these, catastrophic injuries when your whole life is defined by this. This is what you do, particularly in some ways for a male dancer, because as you take Tasha, there's not that many and it's changing now, but for a long time it was very hard to get a boy in your ballet class, and he was encouraged not to be in it, and there were different forces, etc. So to me, the position of Charlie is particularly painful because he was so special and his whole life was built around this, and to have that taken away seems very, very tragic to me. So yeah, he was really important to me too, to represent that side of it.
But that's a risk all athletes take.
Yeah, I wish. Yeah, and if you're a dancer, even if you aren't, first of all, you are going to get injured, but even without a spectacular injury, you have a very short shelf life.
Yeah.
But there's a way that I felt like Charlie, he almost is like the woman normally is, kind of more on the side, right? His life experience has been more kind of like, you're doing something you're not really probably shouldn't be doing, and why are you doing this? And I saw there's kind of an interesting, I don't know, I was sort of thinking about that as I was reading. I just wish we could really do this again after everyone has read the book, so that we can just speak freely. I wanted to say too about you did such a brilliant job incorporating ritual into this book. Not just the rituals, like the rituals with the point shoes. And honestly, just a ballet class is a ritual. You start at the bar and you move to the center. But you've also got in the family dynamic, all these rituals. What do they do after the finale of the Nutcracker every year? They've got all these rituals. How did you talk about what you were doing with all that? I just thought it was really brilliantly done through the whole novel.
Thank you. Yeah, it was I've always been interested in how families, the sort of stories they tell about themselves to each other, and the roles one takes on in the family. And once you have your role, you really can't change. You can be anything else in the outside world, but when you're with your family, Marie is the sort of wild child. She's the sort of undisciplined one. Dar is this sort of powerful one, and Charlie is in many ways the sort of impotent one, because he can't dance, he can't teach, and he is sort of, his body is presented so I really did want to write Dar looking at his body and how beautiful it is, which is normally the way that a man would look at a woman in a book, that he would sort of be turned into the object in some way. And so I was really interested in the way you can shake that, and it can really sort of become claustrophobic. And that's why at the beginning of the book, Marie has sort of started to pull away. You find out right at the beginning that she's moved out of the house, and she's only gotten as far as living in the dance school on the third floor, but they're just sort of interlocked. And I think a lot of families have that experience, not to this degree, but I think it's really can be likely to happen in families where there's some sports or dance or something where you're homeschooled in many ways, and your family's in the enterprise of making this thing happen for you, and everyone is about this one thing, so that it would make it even further, and it would become in some ways like a powder keg when an outsider comes in, as happens in this book.
So I have a question. Why did you decide on this particular location?
That's so hard.
Oh, the location of you
I
mean?
mean, you could have been in Manhattan, you could have been, you know,
Oh,
in a
yeah.
major urban area, which in some ways would make more sense, but instead you've chosen a different landscape for the book.
Yeah, it's sort of an unnamed sort of middle to working class community. And that really is what I wanted, because that was really how I grew up. And the ballet school was really important for that reason, because there just weren't a lot of arts. We didn't have a lot of access to art. And, you know, at that time, there might be a ballet touring group that would come through Detroit maybe once or twice a year, but really that was it. You had to, you know, the ballet school was going to be your access to in-person ballet. So they're everything, and they're a way to sort of give culture to kids. And so they do have more, I mean, they're just more valuable in this emotional way, I think, than they are in a place where there's so many options. So I really wanted that to be there, that they would seem especially glamorous in this town where there's just not a lot of glamour.
Well, and you do have the storied tradition of the former dancers who either age out or injure out, and they go back. I mean, think of the movie The Turning Point, right? You've got the dancers who have moved to, aren't they in Oklahoma or something? I can't remember, Tulsa maybe. But so you have these people, these dancers who are real dancers who come back to a little town. Maybe it's their hometown, maybe it's not. But there's this kind of magical exoticness of them, because they drop back down into this ordinary middle-class town, and it really has an influence on the people who live there.
Yeah, they walk differently, they look differently, you know, because the way everyone talks about how ballet, anybody who dances ballet walks, because it doesn't leave you. And I think they in some ways feel like literally exotic creatures, because they have been through this gauntlet, they have mastered their body. And you know, going back to what you were saying earlier, Barbara, that the risk that they take, which is so fundamental, it is very scary and in many ways problematic, but it's also what we watch it for, right? I mean, so it's sort of the fact that they can do these things that should defy physics. When you see Simone Biles, when they break down that stunt, the New York Times did this sort of graphic where they showed it. You literally can't believe a human being could do it, but these people can do it, which, you know, gives them this especially rarefied air.
It's like watching acrobats at the circus, especially what is their name, Waleska, that, you know, performed without nets. And part of it, you know, you didn't want them to fall, but on the other hand, part of the suspense was, you know, hoping that, I mean, circuses, if you really think about it, lived on that. It was like the guy with the lion tamer, or, you know, and it was a children's event too, which I find fascinating, you know, that we were exposed to these potentially life-ending injuries that people were doing right in front of us, and yet we were supposed to be eating popcorn under the big tent, and, you know, it was all fun.
It's so true. It is sort of why I put it in the book. There's this memory of going to a carnival. The girls remember going to a carnival and seeing a fire eater and a sword swallower. And I remember doing that as a kid. And it did feel like life suddenly became more vivid. It was the thrill of it. It was like nothing I'd ever seen. And there's just something, you know, in our increasingly virtual world about that you feel like you're in a place where something terrible could happen, makes you feel more alive. And we like to believe we wouldn't put, you know, people in dangerous situations, but there is part of us that finds it both exhilarating and quite beautiful.
I'm not sure if Tasha's there or not. Tasha, are you waiting for us?
Oh, okay. I think I'm back. I was getting what happens on my screen is that you guys freeze and then I can hear like every third word. And so I'm not sure what's actually happening when I finally come back and you're moving and speaking.
Just talking about the carnival scenes in the book of seeing a fire eater and a sword swallower. It's like a different version of seeing this magnificent thing in person and feeling like it has this intoxicating glamour, and you want to be part of it, even though, you know, you're sort of risking your life to do it.
Yeah, it's similar, and I mean different, but similar to if you go back to the original fairy tales. I mean, they're brutal, they're violent, and they're being read to children. And now we sanitize things so much that, and it's kind of interesting because why do we do? I mean, I kind of understand why we do it, but at the same time, like, we're drawn to those things. They do make you feel more alive. Something might happen while you're watching it, and that makes you feel more alive. There's something energizing about that, which is maybe a little demented, but there it is.
I think it's elemental. I think that's the reason so many ballets origin are fairy tales. That is, I mean, and look at The Red Shoes, which is my favorite ballet movie, but it comes from a fairy tale where in it, and Christian Anderson, she cuts off her feet because they won't stop dancing. So,
Right.
which, I mean, you know, I mean, that's, you know, in there. And I think it's that, I think it's sort of most dance, the sort of go-to movie among dancers that they talk about, because it is so much about what you will do for your art, and you will make this choice and you will sacrifice everything. And I think that sacrifice is also very intoxicating to us. I mean, I don't know if Dara and Marie even think they had a choice. They were so, I mean, you talked about not remembering choosing, and I do wonder how much of it is beyond choosing. The draw is it just doesn't feel like there's a choice. I mean, you don't remember a single moment, right? You just you were from such an early age, before you had a choice, you were in dance class, and then you were good, so you kept going.
You know, it's easy to see why the Russians are so drawn to these stories and so forth, because there's such a dark element in the Russian soul, not to mention alcohol, but we won't go there. But, you know, I often think about that. And Anderson's fairy tales, most of them were really awful if you plunge down into them, you know, The Little Mermaid. And yet it's not just Disney, you know, there are a couple of operas that I've seen many times. One is Hansel and Gretel, which is a huge Christmas treat at the Metropolitan Opera, you know, and it's all fun. And Cinderella, which actually has some very dark elements. Not in the Disney version, not in the opera version. And I remember when I was a kid, I loved fairy tales, and they would divide them up into books. There would be like the yellow book of fairy tales, remember that, and the blue book of fairy tales, and the green book of fairy tales. And I never could figure out if there was a thematic organization going on, or if they just threw a bunch together and put a different color on it, you know, as a marketing thing, and it didn't really have any relevance to the stories.
I like to think maybe that it's like, these have mutilation in it, so we'll make them green or something like that.
Fairy tales were meant to explain, sort of like Greek mythology, you know, and they're very Germanic. It was a way of trying to make sense out of the natural world and bad things that happen to us. And yet they've ended up giving us these iconic people. Patrick, we should summon you up, because you said you had some questions of your own, and we don't want to squeeze you out of your time.
Oh, okay, great. Well, it's funny, you were talking about the almost the sacramental aspect of it all, which is really fascinating. And, you know, I went to see, what were they called? The Kodo Drummers, you know who they are? Yeah. Wonderful show, but that very insular community, and you were just talking about this a little bit with the sense of you know, that intense focus and commitment comes at a price, you know. And it's some of your recent books have dealt with, you know, that athleticism and you know, excellence, but then the sacrifice that can come with that. I mean, you see that with these two girls, Dara and Marie, and their little kind of messed up family.
Yeah.
You know, you get the sense that, you know, as you say, they're being homeschooled, and you know, and then you throw Charlie into the mix, and everything just gets a little inappropriate real fast. You know, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that really was, I mean, I do find myself drawn to, really close communities. And it was one of the, early on, I knew that I wanted to have, I was also interested in the notion of contractors coming to your home, which is an element that we haven't talked about. But what happens is they have a fire in the studio very early in the book, and they hire this contractor named Derek, who is also like someone out of a fairy tale, because he's the opposite of the ritual and the control and the discipline. He is sort of this chaos, this figure of chaos, and, you know, and sort of, just someone who's used to getting what he wants and just sort of, busts his way into it. So I wanted to have that also be this physical space, because contractors, when they're great, even when they're great and wonderful and do everything right, they're still in your space for a long time, and it makes you so vulnerable. So I wanted to kind of take one of those communities and have someone kind of pull the lid off and start taking things out. And that was when Derek, the contractor, came in. So I would sort of take that stuff and really throw a chaos demon into the mix.
Have you seen, I'm sure you have, that movie, The Wrestler,
Yes.
with
Yes.
Mickey Rourke, have you seen it, Tasha? There's probably a delay there. I bet
Well,
you
and
have. The Wrestler with Mickey Rourke. Well, you were talking about the price of this, and there's some really telling scenes in that film.
I have not, no.
Oh, it's so good. Not to digress too much, but there are some scenes where these old wrestlers, you see them at they're kind of washed up before their time, and they're at this little sad fan convention, and you see half of them have like colostomy bags underneath the table, and their bodies have just been trashed. Some of that reminded me of what you.
Yes. Well, it is directed by Darren Aronofsky, who also directed Black Swan, a ballet movie. So I think
Yes.
he is drawn to that stuff. But that really was how I thought about a lot of the body stuff, the sort of toll. And I watched this documentary about Wendy Whalen, the New York City ballet, famous sort of Balanchine dancer. And it was about her being sort of forced into retirement and then having all these surgeries, is the toll that the years of dance had taken on her body. And she said this thing, and this was as a woman who had been dancing for all of her life, and I think was in her late 30s or close to 40 when she was sort of forced out. But when they talked to her about the danger of the surgery, the risk of the surgery, she said, if I can't dance anymore, I'll die. And she's a very sober, logical, she doesn't talk like that at any other point in the documentary, but you could tell that was her real feeling. And to her, that all this sacrifice and these surgeries and sort of being forced out, it didn't matter, because that's how much it meant to her. And it is one of the contradictions that make it so fascinating. And in the same way, The Wrestler is both sort of grotesque, and it's also really beautiful, and also about family.
One of the things I wanted to bring up, then I'll turn it over to Tasha again, was just the writing. I mean, one of the things I've always admired about your work is the sensual language. And nobody does it like you do it. And were there writers who, not necessarily about ballet, but were there writers who write about athleticism or write about movement? Because capturing, that, I imagine, is quite a challenge. Are there people that inspire you?
It is really hard. I have to say, it's also someone who is no athletic, I had no ability to maneuver my body at all, but it's certainly always, I mean, as a teenager, Joyce Carol Oates was a big influence, because she does talk about the body a lot and the body doing things and such visceral detail, and kind of in sort of unexpected sort of lush tones. I also do read a lot of and you wouldn't always think this would be great writing, because sports or memoirs are not always, but the good ones are really good. And the Kelsey Kirkland one, which I had read as a teenager, even though I reread it for this, the way she talked about the body from the inside, that's really what you want, is to have someone tell you or to read about what it's like from the inside. And then you can sort of layer it with this other stuff, but you're already halfway there, because their vantage point is like, we're just using it's all spectators and from a distance, and it's a tableau, but it's entirely different from the inside. I actually, for one project, I talked to strippers about that and how different it is being on the pole and your vantage point of the audience, not to get into inappropriate territory, but it is very athletic art, and the way they talked about it, it blew my mind because it was so different from what you see when you're at the strip bar. Sorry.
Well, the title of the book is fascinating because it's one of those double, triple duty kind of titles. Was that your original title, or how did you come
No,
to it?
it came very late, but it shouldn't have. It seems so obvious now because it has all these sort of different shadings about a very insular family turning out, it is the sort of thing one has to achieve as a dancer, that 180 degrees from your hip to your toes. And it requires effort. I'm sure Tasha could recall getting it for most dancers, but I was going to be called We Three for a long time, and then no one was really that excited about it, including myself. And then I was talking with my editor Sally Kim, and we kept talking about the turnout and how fascinated we were by it. And then it's like one of those things. Of course, that should be the title because it has all these other connotations. Including some vaguely inappropriate ones. We used it on The Deuce a lot. So when I worked on HBO's show The Deuce. So yeah, it was sort of ended up being perfect.
Tasha, are you back?
I would like to hear.
I can sort of hear you.
Well, maybe we should wind up, Tasha, by asking you.
Yeah,
Megan was going
Turnout.
to. Could we talk to you for a minute about your book since you've been, Megan, did you have a question that you wanted to ask Tasha about Florence?
Well, I would actually love to talk all about Florence, but particularly with love, I guess, I have never done a series. I've always done standalones, and you lived with this series so long and found ways to make it so fresh and beautiful. And you have a voice nailed, but everything else changes. Can you talk a little bit about that? Or did we lose you?
Yeah, that was really, if you can, I don't know if you can hear me, but if you can, I felt like I wanted to, through the series, put the characters in new locations. Because if you're writing a long series, you're limited with what you can change, and you have the same characters, but you want to see them in different circumstances. And it makes it possible to keep it fresh because you're putting the same people in very different environments, places with very different social mores, particularly in that late Victorian, turn of the century time period. And it's a good way to let the reader see the characters in different, how Emily reacts in London is kind of always going to be the same. But if you put her in Constantinople, she's in a completely different world. And so I think that's just a fun way to keep it fresh, but also to keep the characters growing without making them change constantly.
Yeah, and you get to enter, through her, these closed communities, but she is the outsider. So it's sort of the reverse, which I think is so exciting. And you get to, vicariously enjoy these wonderful places and times, which, talk about great research.
Well, Tasha's books are wonderful in that they can be travel logs. Not only do you get to go to different places, but you get to do them in a way you can't possibly do today because, so much has changed. We had a spirited discussion over the 4th of July about her upcoming book set in Egypt when I really want her to set it in a hotel that hasn't been built for like 3 more years. And I finally said to her, it's fiction. And the Winter Palace Hotel defines Luxor for most people. So Tasha, just get over it, put a note in the back that says, I distorted it by 3 years or so. And one of the reasons I loved it, but one of the reasons I really love the Winter Palace Hotel for Tasha's books is that it has the widest hotel corridors I have ever seen. Like 3 people can lie down horizontally across this enormous, and it was built for Victorian women with their enormous clothes and so forth. And you just can't find that. I've been all around the world and I've never seen anything quite so perfect. So I think I know you're a purist in your historical fiction, but I think every once in a while, it's okay. It's just okay, Tasha, to take a little break from it. And, for Megan, it's an interesting thing. We've talked about
It
this.
is. It is.
Well, I was just going to say, we've talked about the difference.
Yeah, I mean,
Oh,
Go ahead. I'm not sure she can see us again.
oh, okay. I don't know. My internet is so bad right now. I'm not sure it's even working. I don't know if my internet is even working at all. So I don't know if you can hear me, but no, I mean, I agree. You can absolutely change things, especially, and I've let people live longer than they did in real life. And I don't know though, Emily and Colin are pretty happily settled on the Dahabia in the Nile though, docked in Luxor. So
But they can go ashore and have tea.
They've just had tea at the Luxor Hotel.
Yeah, well, you'll think of something. It's just a shame to waste it.
but Tasha, you sound like
You know what? Because I literally, oh, I couldn't hear you guys. I'm sorry.
okay. I
That's
was
okay,
going to say
sweetie.
you sound like a former dancer because you know the way you want it and you're going to abide by that. I like that.
Well, one of the things that we have talked about is is that writing standalones is world building every time, and writing a series is different than that.
Well,
but the way Tasha writes, actually, she does do almost a complete world building job in every book. So she's found a way to blend a series with standalones that I find completely fascinating. So anyway, I think maybe at this point we should call uncle. It's been wonderful, Megan, to talk to you. Tasha, it's been delightful. Patrick, thank you. Are there questions that you wanted to bring up from the audience that you haven't addressed?
Let's see. Well, I mean, let's see here. Not really. There's a question where somebody says, you want dark ballet, go to the Rite of Spring. The dancer literally dies in front of a group of men.
Well, there are a lot of dark ballets.
Yeah.
I mean, my only visit to St. Petersburg to see the ballet at the theater was, I'm trying to remember, I think it might have been Giselle. But, most ballets, as Tasha pointed out, are very hard on women. It's just,
they burn brightly until the end.
yeah, but I think Tasha earlier wrote to me and made a wonderful point that, the contrast between the beauty and the darkness is what's so fascinating, that, underneath the tutu, there are real people with injuries. And, I also, there can be a certain grubbiness. I can't remember where I ran into that. Maybe it was in one of the reviews of your book, Megan, when they pointed out that sometimes the costumes don't get washed for years because they're so fragile, and there's an accumulation of sweat and bacteria and all the rest of it, and the dancer looks glamorous over the footlights, but in actual fact, if you ran into her backstage, you might be going gagging.
Well, there is that whole riff in the book, and especially with the sets, there's this facade of perfection.
Right.
And then you peek behind it and you see just what you're talking about.
Yeah, the
I really
snow,
like that.
snow with the Nutcracker, they always talk about the snow because it looks so beautiful in the audience, but it's actually disgusting. If you recycle it, and it has like bobby pins caught in it and dust, and yeah, blood, sweat, and tears. That's what it's about.
It's never wise to buy tickets too close to production of the opera or the ballet. I speak from 70 some years of experience that balcony's actually the best, but there you are, because then the magic is not diminished by reality, which I think is great. And I'm sure, Megan, that people will either turn out more for the ballet or less, depending on what happens. But it's been wonderful to see you and wonderful to talk to you. Thank you both very much. Thank you, Tasha, and thank you, Megan. Our signed copies of the Turncoat should be arriving almost any moment. Fresh from Megan's hand in New York. So thank you all for joining us, and I hope everybody enjoys the rest of their evening. Buy tickets to your local ballet. It's your first opportunity. Good night.
Honey, thank you.
All right.